Hi, welcome. Thanks for joining us. You're watching a recording of First Christian Church Disciples of Christ in Nampa. Senior Pastor, Reverend Dr. Steve Perotti. We believe a lot of things here, like the fact that all people are God's children. All. You heard me right. We have a special heart for those on the margins of society, those who've been shunned, left out, or put down. We seek to offer a sanctuary where your voice is cherished and your presence is beloved. We believe in genuine relationship building, truth-telling, and transparency, warts and all. We've been waiting for you. Let's do this thing together.
Great. All right. So Steve has kind of been doing this series on Jesus and strength and what does it look like. And so I'm gonna kind of take us in a direction that way a little bit. But before I begin, I do want to offer just kind of a little bit of a trigger warning of sorts. Some of the questions I'm going to explore today with us may make you feel a little uncomfortable. I'm doing that with purpose, but you have full permission to take a time out if you need to sort through any of those feelings for yourself, if you need to step out, if you need to talk it out. I'm going to be available a little bit after service, and I'm happy to process some more if you need to. So please just know it's okay. You're not going to offend me or hurt my feelings if you need to step out for a little bit. All right, so I think many of you know that I work as a chaplain. I've been a chaplain in hospital settings for, going on 10 years now. And one of the many, many things that I do in my role is participate on ethics committees in the hospital or hospice, wherever I've worked. Because sometimes in the medical field, there are situations that arise where right and wrong are not always clear, where things are not as black and white as we would like. For example, these are some of the questions that have come up even just this year in my current setting. Is it acceptable to restrain someone who is developmentally delayed and doesn't understand the need for life-prolonging treatment in order for them to receive dialysis? So should we restrain someone who has confusion and can't think through what's going on to give them the medical treatment they need to live? Or is it permissible for a Catholic hospital to perform a medically indicated abortion on a non-viable fetus when the mother experiences PROM? And for those of you who don't know, PROM is preterm premature rupture of the membranes, meaning there's not really an amniotic fluid anymore around the fetus, and the mother is now at risk for infection and death. Pretty complicated questions. And they're not easy to navigate. That's why we have a whole team of people wanting to look at these kinds of questions from lots of different perspectives so that we can hopefully make recommendations that honor people in all of their diversity. So one of my first ethics cases ever occurred while I was still living in East Tennessee. A woman in her 60s had been in and out of the hospital several times over the last 2 months due to complications related to being quadriplegic. And so with quadriplegics, they don't have the use of legs or arms. So she had several health issues, but the primary issue she was facing during this encounter was problems with her breathing. A lot of times when you have issues that cause you to be a quadriplegic, your breathing systems start to decrease and not function anymore. And so about a year prior to this, she'd had a tracheotomy placed. And so that's where they cut a hole in, they put a tube in, you're on a machine that helps you breathe. And this procedure that she had, it was starting to fail. She wasn't able to keep her oxygen levels at an appropriate level without having another surgery to replace some of the equipment that was helping her breathe. And so the medical team recommended that she proceed with the surgery. However, she didn't want it, and she declined their recommendation to have a procedure that would keep her alive. So one of the doctors on her team had some feelings about that response, as I'm sure some of you are having some feelings about that. And so they called for an ethics consult. So I came. And the medical team was asking questions about this woman's competency, so her ability to make her own decisions. They were asking questions about her mental health and how that was playing a role in her decisions, and if she should be allowed to make a medical decision of this magnitude if she were feeling feelings like depression or suicidal ideation. And they asked if there was a more appropriate person, maybe a friend or a relative, that could help her navigate these decisions and possibly make the decision for her if she didn't have the capacity to do it for herself. And so all of these questions are valid questions. These are the kinds of questions that we ask all the time when ethics consults come up or when we're interacting with folks in the medical field all the time. But after meeting this woman and talking with her, these questions kind of got my hackles up. I felt some feelings about the fact that we were questioning this person because the way that she was talking about things indicated that it was okay. But I'm not in the medical field in a capacity that can make that decision. That falls outside of the scope of a chaplain. Really, only a doctor can determine if somebody has the ability to make their own decisions or not. So I requested a neuropsychologist come and join me to visit with this woman and assess from their perspective if she had these abilities and if she was the appropriate decision maker and if she was experiencing any kind of mental health issues that might prohibit her in this moment from making a decision. Could that change down the road? That kind of stuff. So after our visit, I learned that this woman had been in a tragic accident that had caused her quadriplegia almost 10 years prior. So she had been in this state for 10 years up to this point. And a few of her family members had died in the same incident. But she and her sister, they were the only ones that had lived. And this really bonded them in that event. And so for 10 years, this woman had pursued aggressive treatments in the hopes of prolonging her life. And year after year after year, the quality of her life disintegrated. She recounted the hundreds of thousands of dollars spent on numerous surgeries, hospitalizations, and the specialized housing that she needed to keep her alive. She couldn't live on her own with all of the medical equipment and all of her healthcare needs. She needed to live where someone could care for her. She noted that she had had the opportunity to see her only living relative grow and flourish and build a life that she could be proud of. And she recounted the feelings of loss that kept growing each year as more and more of her independence was taken from her. A woman who had been fiercely independent and physically strong, but now could not eat or bathe or bathroom or even breathe on her own. She wasn't depressed. She had taken the time to evaluate her options and laid out her life and decided that her life no longer had the level of quality she found acceptable anymore. She wanted to stop pursuing aggressive treatment and instead focus on comfort. She wanted to wait to withdraw the treatment in order to say goodbye to this one living family member, and she wanted to make her final arrangements to ease the burden of their grief. This woman understood the consequences of foregoing surgery and wanted to plan for her death well. And this made the medical team uncomfortable. Nurses and doctors often enter healthcare because they want to help people. They want to fix it. They want to heal. What they don't understand is, especially when they first go into it, is that sometimes helping people means allowing them to make decisions that we don't agree with and we don't like. That sometimes you can't fix it anymore. That sometimes healing comes through dying. There was one doctor on the team that couldn't accept the recommendation of the ethics committee to allow this patient to withdraw care and forego surgery. And he had a lot of emotions around the situation. Whew, he was mad. And he was taking the anger out on anybody involved in this woman's care. The nurses, the CNAs, the respiratory therapists. And in his anger, he was acting in ways that was increasing the moral distress that the team was already experiencing. So I confronted him. And I remember him just railing in the nurse's station at me about the situation, what he thought about the ethics recommendation. I'm pretty sure the entire floor could hear him. It was pretty bad. Like, people were avoiding that space like the plague. And finally, he says to me, "I'm not letting her do this." Y'all, I felt this white, hot anger fill my gut at that comment. This person of privilege who was able-bodied, who had his health, who clearly had not taken the time to learn about this woman's life and her story and her motivations based on some of the things he was saying about her, this person had the audacity to set aside this woman's autonomy and to silence her voice because he didn't agree with her and because she didn't agree with him and was making a decision contrary to his recommendations. And out of the rage of the injustice I was bearing witness to, I fired back at him, "It's not your decision to make." Later that week, I was sitting in supervision with my boss, and I was relating this story to her, and she's looking at me with this dumbfounded expression on her face, kind of like the one I see a few of you have on yours right now. And we began to have this conversation about the power of emotion and how we can harness that power to learn more about ourselves and to do good work in the world. I think there's this fear that Christians have of certain emotions, the kind that are bad or negative or wrong. And this fear stems from a few places. If we look back in history, we see that classical philosophical debate among Mediterranean giants has significantly influenced Western culture and Christian theology. Some of these famous philosophers, who I'm sure you know, include Greeks like Plato and Aristotle. They wrote extensively about the role emotion played in human life, but remained adamant that emotions must stay under the control of reason if they were to serve their ordained purposes rather than become destructive. Virtuous persons, they argued, use their will to force emotions to function under the rule of reason. They argued, therefore, that emotion should always be under the control and direction of reason, which, along with the will, were the most distinguished parts of the soul. This tension was best communicated through this metaphor that compares emotions to these spirited horses that would pull chariots, and reason to the charioteer. When the charioteer, reason, is in command, the horses, emotion, function effectively and accomplish their purpose. The charioteer is driving them in the same direction. But if the charioteer, reason, loses control, the horses, emotion, pull in contrary direction and chaos results. So after we have these big Greek philosophers, in a similar time period, we also see the Stoics starting to come up. And the Stoics argued that there was no place for emotion in the virtuous life at all. That instead, humanity must detach themselves from all feeling and embrace dispassionate contemplation or apathy. Famous Stoic, his name was Seneca, believes that the mind is vulnerable to the passions and loses its rational powers when emotions are felt and expressed. So you can't even feel emotions. Stoic doctrine held that external concerns should not affect a person's inner life, only reason should. And I don't know about you all, but there's a lot of external things that affect me at least. So I don't know, they could do it, I guess. If we think of such influential philosophers as René Descartes, he's famous for that line, "I think, therefore I am." We see that reason and cognition have become the favored traits of the human species. As we move into the modern era, these thoughts form the basis of this dualism between emotion and reason, where reason is respected and elevated and sought after. And most philosophers become suspicious of emotion, fearful that they had a distorting influence on the process of reasoning. Immanuel Kant, an influential 18th century philosopher, equates emotions as an illness of the mind. And this disease metaphor ends up pathologizing emotion, suggesting that emotions are these intrapsychic events that are abnormal, primarily occurring within a person's private mental functions rather than a result of the interaction with the environment. Another area that influenced our thoughts about emotions comes from psychology. Sigmund Freud, who I'm sure you've all heard of, set the tone by placing passions in the id and separating them from the reasoning, sense-making ego. And in psychoanalytical theory, the rational ego is always in danger of being overwhelmed by the irrational passions of the id. As time goes on, we see Christian apologists adopting similar thoughts and stances as the philosophers and psychologists that we've already mentioned. Early monastic authors frequently used Stoic concepts to contemplate and reinforce their own theological positions. And these ideas are found throughout early Christian writings. One of the main tasks of reason, they agreed, was to control the passions and suppress appetites. Christian lists of virtues and vices, these are, the forerunners of the 7 deadly sins, often referred to parallels between Stoic thought and specific biblical passages. The dualism between flesh and spirit is a major concept that still holds sway within the church today. This theological stance holds that the flesh is corrupt and antithetical, combined those words. So it's corrupt and antithetical to spirituality and interferes with one's ability to unite with God. Flesh, therefore, must be completely overcome to attain salvation. Spirit, in contrast, is pure, the arena in which we meet God. It's easy to see how the dualism of emotion and reason is transposed on the dualism of flesh and spirit. St. Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, Martin Luther, John Calvin, John Wesley, I'm sure these names are very familiar to you. These are but a few of the names of Christian theologians that agreed with the negative assessment of emotions and their role in the spiritual life that still influence our thinking today. So what do we do when all of this history butts heads with our lived experience of emotion? Because I don't know about y'all, but I feel emotion a bunch, like a lot. Where do we turn when we have questions about our own emotional responses, especially in light of the array of emotion displayed in Scripture? Well, in the 20th century, existentialism played an important role in bringing emotion back into philosophical discourse in a more positive light by resisting the division of cognition, affect, and volition into separate faculties of the self, as if they were activities of the mind and heart that functioned without reference to each other, as if we can separate our mind from our heart. Emotions can be thought of as a central aspect of our humanity, enlivening and energizing all of life. I think about huge figures in our faith like Mother Teresa. Was it only ideals that led Mother Teresa and her followers to a life of sacrifice? Or does their choice of vocation depend on a commitment that results from emotional responses to poverty and illness and their love of God. I think of Martin Luther King Jr.'s mind and heart, that they were in agreement that segregation was not only a violation of the Bill of Rights, but untenable from a Christian ethical perspective. When we're emotionally bonded to what our thinking process has identified not only as real, but also valuable, then the emotions we experience provide the energy for the intense commitment and risky actions that support the cognitive conclusions we're making. I think one of the most powerful emotions available to us then is anger. And anger is often thought of as one of these negative or bad emotions that we, especially as Christians, shouldn't feel at all. But in reality, anger is the physical, mental, and emotional arousal pattern that occurs in response to a perceived threat to the self, characterized by the desire to attack or defend. And all of us have seen anger cut a destructive path through many lives. Every day, it seems, I work with people who are angry with their children, angry with their parents, their spouses, their friends, their partners, their employers, their church. Many are angry at themselves for mistakes or weaknesses or failures, both real and imagined. Many are also angry with and alienated from God. Frequently, this anger is expressed in life-destroying ways. I've known people who were badly wounded by abusive anger from powerful others to cope with life effectively. The verbal and physical abuse experienced in childhood by some often affects intimately how they relate with significant others in adulthood. Their patterns of behavior negatively affect their family, their professional life, and their personal life. Anger is a powerful emotion that has destructive potential. Now, that's different than me saying that anger in itself is destructive. So please hear the difference as we continue. By destructive anger, I mean anger that destroys our relationships with ourselves, with others, and with God. Instead of moving us toward loving God with all of our heart, mind, soul, and loving our neighbor as ourselves, creating loving relationships, breaking down barriers, promoting peace, and bringing reconciliation, destructive anger moves us in the opposite direction, toward disunity, estrangement, hostility, and alienation. While creative anger moves us and our community towards spiritual well-being, destructive anger moves us and our community towards dysfunction. You may be asking yourself, okay, so if anger can be destructive and negative and harmful, how can it ever be used in a positive way? Well, anger can put us in touch with an experience of injustice, a breach of relationship, or a threat to an important value more quickly than our cognitive interpretations of the event. What this means is anger often tells us that something we care deeply about is being affected in a negative way, and more importantly, anger moves us to do something about it. Without these emotional attachments to people and ideas, humans find it difficult to make meaning out of life or to even find a reason for living. Emotions then, even the negative emotions like anger, are a gift from God and part of how we reflect God's image. And yes, even God experienced and expressed anger. References to God's anger in the Old Testament are numerous, and the circumstances in which God is angry are very diverse. Even a quick reading of the Hebrew Bible makes it clear that the Hebrew people knew a God who could be angered. The Old Testament frequently refers to God's potential for anger and is filled with specific instances of God's anger. In many stories, to disobey and break the covenant brings the wrath of God. In Judges 2, we see the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. And Jeremiah hears God, as he hears God discuss the idolatry of the people and say that these actions provoke me to anger. And then that God says, my anger and my wrath shall be poured out on this place, on human beings and animals. It will burn and not be quenched. That's a pretty strong language. The Israelites are afraid when God's anger is directed at them, and they ask for mercy in Psalm 6. O Lord, do not rebuke me in your anger or discipline me in your wrath. References in the New Testament are a little less numerous and less obvious, but still there. For example, the author of Hebrews reminds readers that God had said, therefore I was angry with that generation, and identifies the Israelites who followed Moses out of Egypt as the culprits, the ones who were under God's anger. The biggest New Testament example of God's anger, though, comes through Jesus' interactions in the world when God became flesh. The Gospel of Mark reports that Jesus was angry when he confronted the Pharisees concerning whether or not it was appropriate to heal on the Sabbath. So let us read Mark 3, 1 through 5. Again, he, meaning Jesus, entered the synagogue, and a man was there who had a withered hand. They, the Pharisees, watched him to see whether he would cure him on the Sabbath so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man who had the withered hand, come forward. Then he said to the people, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save a life or to kill? But they were silent. He looked around at them with anger. He was grieved at the hardness of their heart and said to the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. Now, there's no question here about what was going on inside Jesus as he looked around at the Pharisees. For when Mark describes the emotion Jesus was feeling, he uses this Greek word, opin. Now, opin is the word for anger most commonly used in the New Testament, and it cannot be translated any other way. The only synonyms to anger in this context is wrath, rage, or fury. So going back to our definition of anger from earlier, the physical, mental, and emotional arousal pattern that occurs in response to a perceived threat to the self, characterized by the desire to attack or defend, let's ask ourselves, how was Jesus threatened by this encounter? Well, we can imagine that his narratives about religious leaders would include the expectation that they would have deeper insight into the tradition they represented, and more wisdom about the foundational desires of God for how believers should function in the world. Perhaps he had the unambiguous descriptions of what God desired written by Amos and Micah. If you recall, they do a lot of stuff about injustice and justice work. And maybe those narratives informed his own about righteousness and justice. Perhaps these religious leaders were concerned with legalistic rules and regulations that seemed to prevent an appropriate response to human need, and such priorities were a threat to Jesus' values. Perhaps their failure to raise love and grace over law, despite their supposed study of the scripture, triggered his anger. There's another story of Jesus' anger that I want to share, and it's when Jesus confronts the money changers in the cleansing of the temple scene. And as it appears in the Gospel of John, I want to read that one because it's the most emotionally charged language to describe the turmoil of all of the gospel accounts of what happened. And so let's read together John 2, 13 through 16. The Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple, he found people selling cattle and sheep and doves, and the money changers seated at their tables. Making a whip of cords, he drove all of them out of the temple, including the sheep and the cattle. He also poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. He told those who were selling the doves, "Take these things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace." Can anyone read this account and doubt that Jesus was angry? I mean, the fury of Jesus' words and the obvious force of his physical presence are visceral to me, at least. So let's ask ourselves again, how was Jesus threatened? Jesus' narratives probably included the value his tradition placed on worship in the temple and of worshipers being treated with fairness as they expressed their devotion. Why should we be surprised that Jesus would be threatened by money changers who were making a mockery of worship, insulting God, and profiting from the law? Jesus was indignant at the injustice and acted prophetically, challenging the ways in which worship had turned into a money-making endeavor. The Bible often describes God's anger in the face of human injustice, and yet we question if God experiences anger. Let's look at some other passages. Clearly, Jesus felt anxiety, worry, and fear when he went out to pray before his arrest. But I think he also expressed anger toward the disciples who accompanied him. Jesus invited several of the disciples to go with him further into the garden in this critical and stressful time. Then he asked them to keep watch while he went alone to pray. But insensitive to Jesus' anxiety and probably oblivious to the events that were about to unfold, they fall asleep. When Jesus returned several times and found them napping, he confronted their unfaithfulness, saying, "Simon, are you asleep? Could you not keep awake for even 1 hour?" I can imagine that being fully human, Jesus' stories about friendship included willingness to be steadfast in their support during a crisis. Imagine how disappointing and frustrating for Jesus to need the sustaining presence of close friends as he faced hard, life-threatening political realities, and then 3 times find that they were unable to stand with him. They had bragged that they would be with him whatever happened, but failed to fulfill their promise. Perhaps he was grieved and angry and expressed this angry disappointment to the disciples. How could you? Finally, let's look at Jesus' experience on the cross. In the garden, Jesus had asked God to remove this cup. He had already suffered lashes and the crown of thorns at the hands of Roman soldiers. He had been nailed cruelly to the cross. Perhaps he was doubting the entire purpose and meaning of his life, wondering whether his whole mission had failed. The excruciating physical pain, perhaps reinforcing his sense of failure, is difficult for most of us to imagine in any depth. And where is God? We can imagine that Jesus had a narrative that included being saved from this painful, humiliating situation. But death was really happening. And here, at the end, obviously, no legion of angels was coming to the rescue. Well, if not rescued, at least Jesus could have expected to have his work and mission confirmed or affirmed in some manner. But God didn't show up in any discernible way. The same God who had sent angels to herald his birth, who had affirmed his son's belovedness at baptism and been present at the transfiguration, was silent, seemingly profoundly absent. Being fully human, Jesus must have felt abandoned and betrayed, left alone now by the one who had sent him. Isn't the coming of untimely death, along with the sense of being abandoned and betrayed, significantly threatening? And in response to these threats, Jesus expresses anger along with confusion and fear when he cried out with a loud voice, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Because of his personal narratives about injustice and his compassionate response to victims, Jesus is torn to the depths of his being by people and groups who suffer and are marginalized. His experiences of irritation and frustration, indignation and anger all arise when his values are threatened, and therefore his anger is in the service of his love and God's love. Anger is not a thing that stirs around in God's psyche like a raging lion, a loose cannon that God's love must constantly monitor and push aside when it's getting too much. Rather, God has the capacity to be angry because God is love. Anger is one of those responses that grows out of and expresses God's love. Because of God's investment in us and our well-being, behaviors that demean, dehumanize, oppress, and cause physical and emotional suffering threaten God. In response to this threat, God feels and expresses anger. Therefore, we can assume that because God gets angry and we are created in God's image, we too should reflect God's capacity for anger. However, we must take responsibility for disciplining ourselves so that our capacity for anger is triggered by the same type of events that trigger God's anger: injustice, radical suffering, and oppression. Too often, though, our anger is triggered by the interpretation of data from our senses that signal danger. Danger to self, danger to ideas and values, danger to loved ones, in opposite ways to how God's anger is triggered. So I'm going to talk about the brain for a minute. I'm going to really try to truncate it though, because it's very you could just go on and on and on. But basically, there are two parts of the brain that interpret data: the amygdala, or limbic system, also known as the feeling brain, and the neocortex, also known as the thinking brain. Now, evidence indicates that mechanisms for seeing and hearing are directly wired to the limbic system, which explains how certain sights and sounds trigger instantaneous responses from the anger circuit, and how we can suddenly become extremely fearful or enraged without a clear idea of why the fear or anger is so intense. You know, those phrases like, "Oh, I'm just boiling mad all of a sudden," right? The limbic system is also tied to memory. And so, when we were cave people, we had to be able to react quickly to life-threatening situations, and our emotional responses are much quicker activators than our thoughts. However, the neocortex, or the thinking brain, usually identifies dangers related to more complicated threats to self, threats to values, meanings, worldviews, special relationships, and plans for the future, all of which contribute to our sense of self and personal identity. So when the thinking brain and the emotional brain work in tandem and memory becomes involved, what actually happens is that on the basis of previous experiences that were recorded and stored in the brain as dangerous, we made an instinctive response to the perceived threat, thus activating our anger. So, how do we move from a place of destructive anger to a place of creative anger? How do we make sure that those narratives and those values that trigger our anger align with the same things that trigger God's anger? Well, we need to ask ourselves 3 questions. And the first question is, how do you know you're angry? If we think of emotions like an iceberg, anger is often the part that we can see on the surface, but down below, there's a lot of other stuff going on. Anger is the emotion, especially for men, that is socially acceptable in certain circumstances. Anger often is the first manifestations of feelings like fear or grief or embarrassment. What does anger actually feel like physically for you? Do you feel it in your gut? Do you feel your temperature rising? Do you feel some increased burst of energy? Right? These are signs that anger is triggered. But perhaps we're evolving toward being more like the image of God by learning to identify our angry responses more quickly and handle them more creatively. In our evolutionary history, our ancestors had to depend on the quickness of the amygdala's interpretation of danger and the activation of the fight-flight response in order to survive. Given the freedom we have to monitor and adapt our narratives, perhaps we can contribute to the ongoing creation of our biological and psychological self in ways that allow us to monitor more quickly when our physiological arousal, when our anger, is necessary and when it's unnecessary. We may not always be threatened by the things we think we're threatened by. So let's ask question number 2. What narratives or values are being threatened by a particular situation? I would argue that given our freedom to choose when to be angry, and again, this is on the basis of the narratives that we adopt and create, we are responsible for assessing our anger to discern whether the narratives that are threatened are ethical or unethical in light of our theological commitments. We have to ask ourselves, do I need to be threatened in this situation? As Christians, especially in those areas that align with God's anger, injustice, radical suffering, and oppression, the answer might be yes, we do need to be angry. If God's love is threatened and responds with anger to those situations, shouldn't they also threaten us, make us angry, move us to action? Finally, let's ask question number 3. When our anger is triggered, how do we respond creatively rather than destructively? There's 2 major ways. And the first one is to speak the truth in love. Verbalize your anger directly, though in a manner that is not sinful. In Ephesians 4, we read, "Put away falsehood and speak the truth with your neighbor, for we are all members of one body. Be angry, but do not sin." Love and truth are expressed in action. We should consider it our responsibility to truthfully identify any injustice expressed toward ourselves, other members of the church, or any neighbor. When any person or system moves against another person or community unjustly, our responsibility is to be a neighbor by speaking the truth about that injustice, though do it in ways that are loving, ways that invite growth and relationship. That's the hope, at least. And then the second thing that we can also be doing is acting in compassionate resistance. And this is resistance without violence. Too often, Christians choose to not express their anger. And in effect, I think this means that we end up colluding with injustice and supporting perpetrators through our silence. The advice in Matthew 5 about turning the other cheek, giving your cloak also, and going the second mile have been interpreted as examples of non-resistance rather than non-violent resistance. In fact, these metaphors have been used to perpetrate abuse, support domination, and enforce acceptance of bondage by all types of authorities, including slave masters, government officials, church leaders, parents, and spouses. But if examined within the context of first century Palestinian life, Jesus is actually giving a revolutionary political statement. To turn the other cheek forces a brutal superior to choose between having to hit with the fist, a sign of equality, or not slapping a second time. So in effect, anger is a gift, reflecting our sacred, created, in God's image nature. God's anger is triggered by injustice, radical suffering, and oppression. And so my hope is that we can find anger to be a powerful spiritual ally that unites us with the heart of God, unites us to each other, and builds strong yet compassionate community. So may you go forth with anger today. Let's pray. God, you are good, and your anger is part of that goodness. Lord, I'm thankful that you are triggered to move in compassionate ways on our behalf. I'm thankful that you do not sit idly by when we face trials or tribulations, when people are oppressed, when they are hurting, when they are isolated or separated, when they're marginalized. God, these things are wrong to you. And I hope, Lord, that they become wrong to us, that we would not fear our emotions, for they are beautifully and wonderfully made. So God, I pray that as we go forth today, would you help us to get in touch with ourselves? Would you grant us the courage to explore our narratives and our values and see why we become angry, and maybe start to move in ways that align with you. So God, we pray and ask these things in the power of your name. Amen.
Thanks for watching. We think what we've learned about God is the best news in the world. That God's love is real, God's love is for you, and God's love is worth it. Our doors stay open because of the generous giving of people like you. If you would like to financially support the ministry of First Christian Church, you can give in person on our website at nampafirstchristian.org or via text by typing in the amount you would like to give and sending that to 208-314-3322. May God's love be real to you today. We'll catch you next time.